Evil West is a remarkably direct take on third-person action. This is a linear, propulsive combat game with little in the way of unnecessary distraction. There's no open-world diversions, no loot, no crafting, and no side quests. In some ways, it feels like a bit of a throwback, but critically the combat system at its core is fast-paced, responsive, and fair, and the B-movie style plot is well told through a series of high-quality cinematics. Unfortunately, the game has garnered a little bit of controversy prior to release. At issue here is a pretty unexciting set of resolution options, as reported by the game's publisher. The current gen consoles are restricted to 1080p in their 60fps performance modes, with Series S locked to a mere 1080p 30. But if we look past the raw pixel counts, is there an attractive game underneath? And is performance really as straightforward as a simple 30fps 60fps split? Evil West does some things really well in terms of assets and rendering quality, with a few obvious areas that could use improvement. The game has some really beautiful environments, from sandy deserts to snowed-in summits to damp catacombs. There's a lot of really attractive assets, lighting, and environmental design on display. Evil West is still very much an Unreal Engine 4 game, so expect a heavy reliance on baked lighting within fairly static environments, but I love the way the visuals often come together. That's not particularly exceptional, I suppose, but what truly impresses here is the sheer variety on display. Each level takes place in a brand new area with unique assets and a fresh visual language, which means that every 30 minutes to an hour or so, you're transported to a unique location with novel sights and plenty of interesting artwork. Some of the vistas here look excellent, and a lot of effort has clearly gone into making the game feel fresh, without really making any compromises on the quality of each area. That extends to the game's cinematics. Evil West features a surprising amount of high-quality cutscenes, almost all of which are pre-rendered. These are high-fidelity, offline-rendered Unreal Engine 4 sequences that seem to be mostly based on in-game assets, but with improved lighting and excellent animation. Evil West is a very action-packed game, so I was surprised to see this much time and attention put into delivering a compelling narrative experience. Combat is obviously the highlight of Evil West, and the results don't disappoint. The game blends melee fighting with fast shooting and a nice variety of special abilities and cooldowns. All the animation work feels really polished and responsive here, with seamless transitions. Every hit launches plenty of stylized blood and guts into the air, which feels really satisfying and provides useful visual feedback. This is all backed up by extensive per-object and camera motion blur, which some may find excessive but I quite liked. In motion, the action looks fantastic, particularly when lots of enemies and particles are on screen. Really, Evil West's production values are just impressive in general. Coming from Flying Wild Hog's prior titles, which were mostly budget-priced, more limited game experiences, this feels categorically different and much improved. Evil West stands shoulder to shoulder with other full-priced releases of recent times, with a skilled use of Unreal Engine and a lot of artist hours invested into this game. So what doesn't work? Evil West is expectedly a very cross-gen title, so a keen eye will spot all kinds of concessions to 2013-era hardware. Asset quality, for instance, looks good for the most part, but not everything holds up to point-blank scrutiny, with some slightly chunky geometry and low-resolution textures in places. This is par for the course for most games we see nowadays, but no particular effort seems to have been invested into making these areas well-suited for a 9th generation console. All the expected 8th gen visual signatures are here, most notably a pretty heavy reliance on screen space effects. SSAO and SSR are obvious, but screen space shadows also come along for the ride. In stills, these effects do hold up quite well, but you can notice some awkward disocclusion with the screen space shadows in motion, particularly when they originate from larger pieces of geometry. Lighting does look pretty good in general, with convincing bounce and dramatic light placement, but there are some issues. Baked GI solutions do tend to struggle with dynamic objects, and Evil West just doesn't acquit itself particularly well on this front. The player character is the worst culprit. Just look at the bright specular sheen on his backside here. In indirectly lit areas, the character usually looks something like this, with a sort of specular glow that is pretty distracting. That applies to other enemies and NPCs in the game as well, though it's usually most noticeable on the player during typical gameplay. Perhaps a different ambient occlusion solution could have helped occlude more of the specular when appropriate, or perhaps the specular properties on character models should have been tweaked to reduce the effect. Ultimately, this isn't a huge issue, but it does stand out at times and should probably be adjusted. It helps that the game does take a semi-stylized approach to character rendering, so a bit of odd-looking specular here and there doesn't feel as out of place as it might in a more realistic title, but it still doesn't look great. There are some issues with the game's baked lighting as well. For larger environments and broad exterior spaces, everything looks very good for the most part, but smaller details don't convince quite as much at times. A lot of this probably comes down to the resolution of these effects, and we do see some odd-looking results in places. The game's real-time shadow maps also exhibit pretty limited resolution as well, with a fair bit of aliasing. Some interiors do fare particularly poorly, however, like these shacks which seem to be missing proper GI. Realistically, we should be getting a much brighter interior environment due to light bounce based on the very bright exterior lighting here, but instead it's basically pitch black. Again, this kind of issue isn't especially common, but a bit of tweaking and more extensive probe coverage could have helped. Though obviously, as a pretty thoroughly cross-gen title, we wouldn't expect to see a totally comprehensive GI solution. Overall, I'm pretty pleased with Evil West's graphics, outside of a few issues. Image quality and performance, however, are a bit more fraught. According to Focus Entertainment, Evil West features just 4K 30 and 1080p 60 modes on Series X and PS5, with Series S limited to just 1080p 30. On the face of it, that doesn't seem particularly great for a cross-gen title. Something like 1440p 60 or above would be more typical for most similar efforts on PS5 and Series X, often paired with a bit of upsampling to resolve a more detailed image than the base resolution would imply. The 4K 30 mode at least seems like roughly par for the course, if a bit unexciting, but the reality is more complicated. If we take the Series X and PS5 versions in their quality modes, which should provide a 4K presentation, they look pretty coherent and stable, but a little bit soft. Pixel counts in quality mode show a 1728p resolution on both PS5 and Series X, which helps to explain this discrepancy. The performance modes, however, clock in at the promised 1080p resolution. Likewise for Series S, which hands in a 1920 by 1080 presentation as well. It's pretty difficult to pixel count this game, unfortunately, as the motion blur can't be disabled, which obscures pixel edges, and the cutscenes are almost all pre-rendered. But the overall presentation of the game in its various configurations on current-gen consoles is consistent with 1728p and 1080p respectively, and all the pixel edges I was able to measure came in at those figures. For a cross-gen game without any obvious boundary-pushing features, this is a little bit disappointing. At 1080p, Evil West can look somewhat murky, and the quality modes on PS5 and Series X, while definitely improved, don't deliver the sort of image clarity that we're used to seeing from 30fps games on the premium current-gen consoles. Perhaps Evil West is uniquely taxing for some reason, but even if so, some upsampling or dynamic res would likely deliver a more detailed result on a 4K display panel. Outside of resolution, the current-gen consoles look very similar across the various visual modes. The only exception is that the shadow maps seem to be filtered slightly differently on PS5, in both the performance and quality modes. The actual resolution of the shadow maps appears about the same, but the shadows do appear sharper with more defined edge detail. This does have the unfortunate side effect of making the relatively low shadow res more obvious, so I tend to prefer the look of the shadows on the Xbox platforms. Unfortunately, Evil West does suffer from some performance issues. The good news here is that I couldn't spot any load-related dips across any of the current-gen console platforms or modes. So the 60fps modes on PS5 and Series X run at a locked 60fps, and the 30fps modes, well, they don't have framerate drops in the usual sense. But the 30fps modes do suffer from intrusive frame pacing problems. Essentially, you get batches of oscillating 16 and 50 millisecond frames on a frequent basis, giving the game the appearance of small stutters and inconsistent motion. It's pretty irritating and makes these modes feel much worse to play than they otherwise would. And that's a bit of a shame, because I think Evil West is actually pretty nicely configured for a reasonably smooth 30fps experience otherwise, with plenty of motion blur and very responsive animation. But the broken framerate cap really needs to be fixed for these modes to work as they should. It's an especially urgent demand for the Series S, which lacks a high framerate mode entirely, and is stuck with a jittery fluctuating 30fps. If you have the option, I think the performance modes on Series X and PS5 are definitely the way to go for now, though all modes on current generation consoles could use some work. Evil West is an excellent action game. The combat system is fast and flexible, blending together melee and ranged weaponry with a host of special abilities without feeling overwhelming. Hit responses are satisfying, and enemies hit hard but have clear and properly telegraphed attack patterns that are fun to learn and to maneuver around. I really enjoyed my time with the game, and I think Flying Wild Hog has achieved something special here. It helps, of course, that the game generally does look very good, with excellent environments and a ton of visual variety. This is a thoroughly cross-gen effort, of course, and there are some lingering pain points with the game's lighting, but on the whole, I am pretty satisfied with the visual makeup of this title. Unfortunately, Evil West is let down by configuration issues. Image quality isn't great, with a softer than usual presentation on current-gen consoles, especially on Series S and in the game's performance modes. It's not a deal breaker, but it does fall below expectations for a cross-gen game. Evil West's performance is harder to excuse, with a ton of unnecessary judder, courtesy of an improperly frame-paced output when targeting 30 frames per second. If you can overlook those problems, this is a very enjoyable title, but with a bit of extra attention and a few patches, Evil West could really shine. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.